All right, welcome everybody, and thank you for here. Thank you for being here at the Friends of the Cabildo lecture series. This is a free benefit to many of you that take advantage of this. If not, it's a small fee, but you can always just waive that fee, just becoming a member of the Friends of the Cabildo. We support the Louisiana State Museum through exhibits, collections, um, education. We just paid for a lecture down that took place at the Mint on John Coltrane's role in New Orleans. We just purchased a new map you're going to read in your newsletter coming to you from, I think, 1886 that just came up an auction at Neal Auction for the museum's collection. So all of your money as members goes towards spending money on the State Museum, and we're very happy to do that and increase the collection or the education or the exhibits, like the Botanica exhibit, which opened up this summer that the Friends paid for. So I hope you take advantage of that. Just to give you a quick update on what's going on with the Friends, last night we opened our four-class Founding of New Orleans lecture. It's 8 hours of class time with UNO professor Dr. Charles Chamberlain. Um, we record everything just like this, so you're welcome to always sign up late, and we send you the recordings, and then you can watch them live later on. And then also we were able to actually finalize to yesterday the history of carnival class. That's going to be January 8th. It's again about 8 hours of class time. We're gonna have Dr. Karen Leatham talking about the origins of carnival. We're going to be talking about satire and folk carnival. We're going to have Dr. Barry Asale from University of Louisiana Lafayette talking about Cajun Mardi Gras, which is new this year. We're going to talk about African American Carnival with Dr. Kim Vaz DeVille. And then we're going to talk about throws and the new exhibit at the Presbyterian about Sam Nicholas, who was a costume designer. And we have a lot of actual costume drawings, which are hard to find in the exhibit, as well as the actual costumes that were designed with those drawings, which is almost rare to find. We also have our Go See Gallivant coming up October 18th at the Cabildo. And for the member lecture series, we have we have two in October, one on pralines, which is kind of interesting, kind of fits into something I'm sure we're going to mention tonight a little bit that could come up. And then we're going to, October 15th, Joseph Jewell, White Man's Work, Race and Middle Class Mobility into the Progressive Area. So I hope that's plenty of items that would entice you to come to some of our events or to check them out online. Our speaker tonight is Theresa McCulla. Theresa is the author of Insatiable City, Food and Race in New Orleans, which just came out a couple months ago, April, Theresa?
May, yes, May.
May. And it's from the University of Chicago Press. I did send you a link. She was able to get 30% off. So if you love the lecture, or you're looking for it for a library or something like that, please use that and you can get the book off from Chicago Press for 30% off. So I want to welcome Theresa, and we're excited to have you here tonight and to talk about this really interesting concept as a, as a entertainment city. Sometimes we also, even though we love our food, we also don't realize how important it is to all aspects of life in New Orleans. So I'm excited to hear what you have to say, and thank you so much for being here.
Great. All right. Well, thank you, Jason. And I'm going to start sharing my screen. So let's see. Okay. Can everybody see that?
Yep, that looks great.
Great. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much to all of you for tuning in this evening. Maybe you're in New Orleans, maybe you are elsewhere. I am saying hi to you from Washington, D.C. I'm so grateful to the Friends of the Cabildo for inviting me to speak as part of your member lecture series, and I'm appreciative of Jason Strada for inviting me. You're hearing from many talented authors this season, and I'm very honored to be included among them. So my talk this evening will center on my research, especially as explored in my book, Insatiable City, Food and Race in New Orleans, which, as Jason mentioned, was published earlier this year by the University of Chicago Press. And to begin our brief time together this evening, I'd like to start with the bookends of the book, the first and the final pages of Insatiable City. Unintentionally, but perhaps unsurprisingly, This study of the long history of eating in New Orleans begins and ends with the same ingredient, which is rice. But that's not to say that the story ends in the same place where it starts. In late August 1718, a ship named the Aurore made landfall on the western coast of Africa. The previous month, the captain and his crew had set sail from Saint-Malo, France, on behalf of the Compagnie d'Occident. In Cap-Laou and Ouida, in present-day Côte d'Ivoire and Benin, company representatives purchased 201 people as slaves. On November 30th, 1718, the vessel departed, directed west across the Atlantic Ocean, bound for the French territory of Basse Louisiane. During the more than 6-month voyage, which you see mapped here on this map, the enslaved people lay shackled on their sides in the ship's hold. 11 crew members and 1 enslaved person died on the journey. That was a much lower mortality rate than would be the case on more than 35,000 transatlantic slave voyages. And when the Aurore dropped anchor in June 1719, it became the first ship bearing enslaved people to arrive in Louisiana, having come directly from Africa. Also among its cargo was rice. With the Aurore's arrival in Louisiana in 1719, African bondspeople and one of the signature foods that would fuel their labors and adorn the tables of their enslavers arrived together on Louisiana soil. And in ensuing years, rice would of course prove to be a central ingredient in many New Orleans dishes, such as gumbo, red beans and rice, jambalaya, kala, and more. This ingredient, together with the people who cultivated, prepared, and served it, would help define the city's cuisine as iconic and globally renowned. The name of that 1719 ship, Aurore, signaled the dawn of a dark day, though. Streams of human, edible, and inedible commodities would flow through Louisiana from that point forward, generating a consumer's paradise for some and hardship for many others. 300 years later, rice remained at the center of the New Orleans table. Specifically, in one of the city's kitchens, a Nigerian-born chef cooked for customers who stood in line waiting to buy plates of jollof rice. The context in which he did so, however, was very different from that of West Africans in Louisiana kitchens many generations earlier. Chef Tunde Way emigrated to the United States as a 16-year-old around the year 2000. Initially, he lived with family in Detroit, where he began cooking professionally. After arriving in the US, Way explained to a journalist he had needed to learn what it meant to live as a Black person in this country. Unfamiliar with this country's history, culture, and economics, Way read literature, sociology, and journalism to understand. Smaller familial wealth, barriers to property ownership, police violence, ambient microaggressions, and other disadvantages pulled at the advances of Black Americans, Way learned. In the dining industry, Way saw glaring evidence of the continuing repercussions of slavery rippling through generations and persistent discrimination. The time of dining as escape is over. The notion of food as art is finished. The era of dining as protest is now, Way declared in a 2016 essay. He believed in restaurants' power, and precisely because of that power, he argued, chefs and other food industry members could not permit dining to revolve around the diner's comfort. The only way to force change is to say something, however inconvenient, Way wrote. The truth must spill onto our dinner plates. Chef Way spilled the truth onto the plates of diners in New Orleans, Pittsburgh, Nashville, and across the United States, creating experiences designed to provoke conversations about racism and inequality over a plate of food. Among these projects was Sartia, a pop-up lunch stall in Center City, New Orleans that Way ran in February 2018. This is more than lunch, this is an experiment, a chalked sandwich board announced next to the window where diners placed their orders. On the menu were dishes like fried plantains with sweet peppers, braised in blanched palm oil, and jollof rice with frijol, rice and broken tomato sauce with coconut and bean pudding with cloves. Before a diner placed her order, Way asked her if she understood the meaning of the racial wealth gap and what it looked like locally and nationally. When a Black diner ordered her lunch, Way charged $12. When a white diner ordered the same meal, Way asked but did not require the diner to pay $30. The price difference was not arbitrary. He had calculated the divide based on disparities in median wealth and income between white and Black Americans. International media reaction was incredulous. Even if nearly 80% of white diners chose to pay the higher price for their lunches, as Way reported, other public responses on social media were profanely furious. Angry online commenters recounted how they felt targeted for different treatment, a separate level of service at a restaurant, and more asked of them simply because of the color of their skin. The terms of their outrage, however, together with scholarship on the realities and effects of racial wealth disparities, prove the conceptual basis of Way's experiment. Feeling uncomfortable at one of Way's meals pointed to the other side of the coin, the comfort that that diner was used to feeling at all other meals. Chef Way invited everyone to his table. He placed a dollar amount on the privilege with which some had arrived, though, and asked them what they wanted to do about it. Much happened in the 300 years that passed between the Aurora's arrival in Louisiana with its cargo of humans and rice, and the moment when a West African-born chef in New Orleans sold a plate of jollof rice to his customers. Crescent City residents and visitors endured civil war and world wars, segregation, epidemics and pandemics, hurricanes, urban change, political fracture, and currents of people, land, and water on the move. Nevertheless, at the center of these two moments with which we began were the same subjects and themes. People, specifically those of African descent, food skillfully prepared, culinary labor, the work of food, and the pleasures, hardships, and contradictions that food can generate. Why did the tangled union of food, people, and race remain so persistently knotted at the center of New Orleans culture and identity amidst such thorough change and through such a passage of time? For that matter, why should we care about the history of food and drink? What are food and drink uniquely capable of teaching us about our past, present, and future? These are some of the questions that Insatiable City attempts to answer. This book explores the manifold powers of food and drink in relation to race. It begins in the era of chattel slavery in Louisiana and concludes in the mid-20th century, when tourists and civil rights activists sat at the New Orleans table. Throughout this sweep of time, many diners and visitors enjoyed New Orleans cuisine as a realm of leisure and easy pleasure, seemingly incapable of having harmful effects. This study reveals a different history. It argues that the sensory pleasures of eating and drinking in New Orleans were often rooted in social, economic, and political systems of great violence. Furthermore, the charming and purportedly easy nature of these experiences often worked to soften and obscure that violence, empowering its persistence. Whether in the 19th century or the 20th, my research found many white European and American diners wanted the delicious food that was so often made by Black New Orleanians and wanted the idea of Black New Orleanians in the kitchen, but they often pushed the people away, segregating them, stereotyping them, and commodifying their images and the things they made. These are challenging and often difficult stories. At the same time, my research also revealed histories of incredible resilience, skill, creativity, and joy. Even if food and food work were often wielded as means of subjugation, Black New Orleanians of every era used food and their work with food for their own ends. They made food into the means to achieve freedom and build autonomy, belonging, and pleasure for themselves, their families, and their communities. Insatiable City is the history of their lives and work too. Food opens the door to all of these intimate and complex histories of people, place, and identity. With that being said, I'd like to suggest that one of the most important and useful reasons to study the history of food and drink is that this theme directs us to understand the people who work to fill the table and clear it, and the nature of their work. Often throughout American history, these kinds of individuals have been women, people of color, and immigrants. Historically, many have been illiterate. In New Orleans and many other places, many food workers were enslaved or fugitives from slavery. They were the working poor and people on the move. And so historians frequently point to quote unquote silences or gaps in official records and archives that can make the paths of these people challenging to find. But more recently, some scholars have proposed new ways of thinking to approach women and men of the past who built lives amidst extraordinary challenges. These researchers read against the grain, as they put it, in search of people whose paths emerge from between the lines or in the margins of archival sources, or in other places entirely. For example, when investigating the path of a young woman named Maddie, who traveled from Virginia to New York City at the turn of the 20th century, scholar Saidiya Hartman approached the woman and her history not as an archival gap or silence or deficiency, not as a chasm that needed filling. Rather, Hartman turned the tables, declaring, quote, "It is a story that exceeds the archive." The movements and possibilities of Maddie's life and those of many others were bigger and richer and braver than the scant details accorded to them in official and institutional records. In New Orleans, histories of rice grown, gumbo cooked and served, and oysters shucked often exceeded the archive too. So to explore these themes this evening, I will focus on the New Orleans table broadly defined and on the stories of several women food entrepreneurs. As with our opening anecdotes, these individuals and the tables they filled were separated by a broad swath of time, and their stories show the ways in which food and food work have been used to wield power over others, and at the same time to claim autonomy and power too. And so our first table is set in the mid-19th century, and the second will be set in the mid-20th century. On January 11th, 1855, a Wisconsin newspaper reporter took part in a popular tourist pastime in New Orleans. "Being a looker-on in New Orleans," he wrote, "I attended a slave auction." He described his surroundings in one of the city's most luxurious settings. The sale was held in the rotunda of the St. Louis Hotel, a circular area of something like 100 feet in diameter, over which rises a dome as lofty as a church spire, he described. Columns surrounded him, and a marble mosaic floor lay beneath his feet. The reporter watched as a 45-year-old woman named Harriet ascended one of the room's auction blocks and stood elevated 5 feet above the crowd of bidders and drinkers below her. Offers lingered around $1,450. Then the reporter called, "Someone says that she is a very good cook." This changed things. $1,500 is bid, he wrote. $1,525, $1,550, $1,575, $1,600. All other bids have dropped off, and the contest is between two men, both of whom appear to be fond of good living, he wrote. They bid lively. Each wants a cook and each wants a triumph. Harriet's reputation in the kitchen tipped her price of sale to $1,920, the second highest of the lot. Her sale price also significantly exceeded the mean value of around $1,200 paid for enslaved women domestic laborers in New Orleans auctions at the time. Motivated by hunger for Harriet's food and the confidence instilled by whatever may have been in their glasses, the men bid, one triumphed, and Harriet's life changed. Thirst and hunger, far from the spiritual kind despite the St. Louis Hotel's church-like features, fueled the transactions in this room and others like it in New Orleans. Prior to the Civil War, New Orleans distinguished itself on the auction block and at the table, two distinct but intimately related settings. The city hosted the nation's largest market of enslaved people, as well as a roaring leisure scene that revolved around food and drink. These industries fed off each other. Slave yards, auction houses and exchanges, coffee houses, billiard saloons, oyster stands, and grand hotels like the St. Louis and the St. Charles proliferated to sustain the men and women who bought and sold enslaved people. Food and drink played a special role in these transactions, forging a singular bond between realms of cuisine and slavery. Within the blended business and leisure world of antebellum New Orleans, bonds, people, food, and drink were conjoined commodities, things presented for sale, often at the same time in the same settings. The physical spaces where these experiences and transactions occurred were far from neutral backdrops. Rather, the built environment of New Orleans trades in food, drink, and enslaved people was instrumental in teaching those in power to enjoy the city as a place where everything was for sale: a cup of punch, a person, a plot of land. The table, the bar, and the block were settings designed to enable a seamless melding of eating, drinking, buying, and selling. By 1840, New Orleans was the wealthiest city in the United States and the third largest, a destination for those who dreamt of striking it rich and spending those riches. Nowhere was this fact on more celebratory display than in the Crescent City's fine hotels, which fused consumption and the commodification of people into the linchpins of early New Orleans identity. Visiting the Crescent City in 1839, one traveler observed, "By far the most splendid and the most costly of the edifices in New Orleans are not the public buildings, but the hotels." Two monumental hotels in particular drew international renown and supercharged the region's economy. The St. Charles and the St. Louis hotels, which opened in 1837 and 1838, were the two suns around which New Orleans' American and Creole universes turned. Each establishment exerted a gravitational pull on the people and businesses in their orbits. I can never forget those marvelous 2 blocks upon St. Charles Street, running from the great hotel towards Lafayette Square, reminisced one traveler in the 1840s. They were redolent of oysters and lunches, juleps and punches, he wrote, and filled with the echoes of falling 10-pins and clicking billiard balls. The sights, sounds, and tastes of New Orleans had imprinted themselves on his memories, and at their center was a grand hotel. Distinct from their peer establishments in other cities, the St. Charles and St. Louis hosted slave auctions as prominent public events. Some businesses elsewhere in the nation, such as the London Coffee House in late 18th century Philadelphia, also auctioned bondspeople. But in most American places, these transactions remained inaccessible to passersby. In New Orleans, in contrast, the auctions, banquets, and barrooms at the St. Charles and St. Louis drew sugar planters, reporters, travelers, and abolitionists like moths to a flame. Inseparable from the dining and drinking in which visitors indulged at these same businesses, public auctions of enslaved people carved a singular niche for New Orleans in the region's economy and social world. Occupying most of the city block bounded by St. Charles, Gravier, Carondelet, and Common Streets, the St. Charles Hotel fixed itself in the impressions of many visitors. One English tourist called the St. Charles the largest and handsomest hotel in the world. Echoing prominent public buildings elsewhere in the United States and Europe, the hotel's neoclassical design proclaimed grandeur, order, and refinement. Nevertheless, encoded in the design of the St. Charles Hotel was the critical importance of drinking and dining in their proximity to, if not the coincidence with, the auction of enslaved people. Architectural plans show how these activities entwined in real space. A guest on his way to bid at a hotel auction could pass through the structure's columned vestibule on St. Charles Street, which you see at the bottom center of your screen here. Look left to supply himself from the small cigar shop, or right to the newspaper shop, pass curving flights of stairs up to the saloon, or proceed forward through doors leading to the barroom. As he entered the space, the smells and noises of the city streets receded behind him. Before him was a temple to profit and the pleasures of its pursuit. There, one visitor observed, Emperor Appetite and King Alcohol hold their court in a most recherché style. Embedded in the center of the St. Charles Hotel's lower level, the barroom anchored the monumental building that unfolded around and above it. 70 feet wide, with ceilings of 20 feet, the octagonal space featured an interior circular range of Ionic columns, as the directory wrote, distributed so as to support the weight of the floors and partitions of the upper stories. Irish-born architect James Gallier remembered the bar that he had designed as, quote, an extensive counter constantly supplied with various kinds of eatables, furnished gratis to anyone who chose to pay for one of those drinks or compounds for which American bar rooms are celebrated. Day and night, the room was populated by hundreds of steady, conscientious lovers of lunches and liquors, one traveler wrote, clustering by pillar and column in social merriment. A New York Daily Tribune reporter who observed one auction in the St. Charles barroom in April 1861 described the discordance of a boisterous crowd of 200 men carousing while bidding on 24 men, women, and children. The marble bar, which covers the rear sides of the apartment, was doing a brisk business, the reporter wrote, with 3 attendants being kept active to supply with bibulence the noisy groups before it, which sent forth a confused sound of conversation, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. Vastly outnumbered by the hungry and thirsty crowd, which included women at a finer venue such as this one, enslaved people stood in a line waiting to be sold, their lot numbers pinned to their clothing. Attendees clutched printed lists of the Negroes, one reporter wrote, as if they were playbills, and listened to the auctioneer's calls. Some bidders seemed intoxicated, the reporter noted, with bleared eyes significant of recent dissipation. On this day in April 1861, about a year before New Orleans would fall to Union forces, bidders at the St. Charles Hotel drank as they purchased the labor and lives of children. The reporter described the scene. Humans sold included Minerva, a serious-visaged 16-year-old field hand wearing a colorful head kerchief, 12-year-old Catherine, a mere child, and Betty, 15, holding her 4-month-old son, who tossed his round head about, surely confused and frightened by the shouts and smells around him. Drinking and bidding at St. Charles Hotel auctions fueled voracious appetites for food, too. On the hotel's principal story, the gentleman's ordinary stretched nearly the entire depth of the hotel, illuminated by a row of windows overlooking Gravier Street, a major commercial spine. You'll see that on the left side of your screen here. Newcomers marveled at the frenetic activity in the men's dining room. The door opens, a hum of voices and a clash of knives and forks and spoons salute you stunningly. What is the occasion? A gala day, a public dinner? One observer teased his reader. Nothing but the gentleman's ordinary of the hotel. This crowd of hundreds appeared and disappeared day by day, he wrote, relentlessly eating and drinking. The writer recalled those fresh from the gumbo soup and the ham and the punch and the julep, rushing back again, unable to be tormented by the mere looking on. Reflecting on his hours at the St. Charles, the writer confessed, I tremble to think of the juleps and punches and nogs and soups and plates of fish and game and beef and loaves of bread. His body felt their pull long after his departure. Focusing on the histories of settings such as these exposes the extent to which many of early New Orleans' delights were a zero-sum game. Gratification came at the expense of many others' pain. The city's luxury hotels represented the literal and figurative building blocks of this story. Within the St. Charles Hotel and St. Louis Hotel, planters and their wives sipped cups of sugared punch while bidding on enslaved men bound for sugarcane fields. At tea tables in cities like Boston and London, the enslaved people and their pain required to produce a teaspoon of sugar may have been abstract shadows. In New Orleans, however, these entities were made plain and collapsed into one experience and one transaction. And this is a postcard in the collection of the Historic New Orleans collection, which pictures a woman who has returned to the St. Louis Hotel, and the caption on the bottom notes that she had been sold on that auction block when she was a child. Enslaved and free New Orleanians neither consented nor submitted readily to the system, of course. Some enslaved people used the profits from their food work to escape from slavery. Some free people of color used food and drink to secure financial independence, if not wealth. Literally and figuratively, they did this work in the shadow of slavery, steps from auction blocks where people who looked like them were sold to the highest bidder. Looking at their stories shows how the history of insatiable appetites in early New Orleans may be told from the other side of the table, too. The stories of two early entrepreneurs in particular reveal the remarkable and hard-fought possibilities associated with working with food in antebellum New Orleans. Their past can be reconstructed partially by assembling multiple kinds of records held in different research libraries and collections. In the midst of tumultuous and hostile circumstances, they used food to unite their families and build and sustain independence. Catherine was the name of a young woman who had been sold at an auction in New Orleans in the early 1800s. She worked in Louisiana cotton and sugarcane fields, then as a house servant for the ill wife of a French-born slaveholder. Catherine was first able to earn wages by washing clothes. So anxious was she to obtain her freedom, her father wrote later in his autobiography, that she worked nearly all her time, days and nights and Sundays. A job as a steamboat stewardess enabled Catherine to finally wedge open the door to freedom. In addition to passenger tips and her monthly pay of $30, she also had liberty to sell apples and oranges on board, her father explained. With each piece of fruit sold, Catherine saved. At last, she amassed $1,200, the price her enslaver had set for her freedom. After purchasing her own freedom, Catherine plunged back into Louisiana to find her sister, Charlotte. The women persuaded Charlotte's enslaver to let the two of them work on a steamboat together for the wages of one, as their father described. They saved an additional $1,200 to manumit Charlotte too. With apples and oranges handed over to anonymous masses of passengers, Catherine and Charlotte clawed their ways to freedom. Impatient, distracted, and hungry perhaps, the customers who held out their money to the women in front of them, receiving a piece of fruit in return, likely did not understand the transaction's significance. Food, cheap fruit by the piece, served as the medium that enabled these two women to propel themselves from enslavement to freedom. Food work played a similar role in the life of another woman vendor who worked in Louisiana during the same era. Lucette Barberousse was born around 1796 in the French colony of Saint-Domingue, 3 years after the abolition of slavery there. At some time and place, likely as a child brought to Cuba by French citizens fleeing the Haitian Revolution, Barberousse became enslaved and was conveyed to Louisiana. Archival strands of Barberousse's story in New Orleans began in the 1830s. And here I'm going to share a few examples of some of the kinds of documents that enabled me to find parts of Lucette Barberousse's story. In the summer of 1835, a free woman of color died in New Orleans without a will. The woman had a 21-year-old granddaughter named Marie Olive Saint Laurent, who was also a free woman of color. Saint Laurent petitioned authorities to conduct an inventory of her grandmother's estate and to be considered her heir. Commissioning this inventory enabled Saint Laurent to inherit a family of 5 women and girls whom her grandmother had enslaved. These were 39-year-old Lucette Barberousse, her 72-year-old mother named Jazie, and Lucette's 3 daughters named Annette, Louisa, and Etienne. And at the time they were 12, 8, and 6. The estate inventory identified Lucette as a mulâtre slave laboring as a marchand or hawker and estimated her value at $500. In New Orleans and the surrounding region, vending food on foot was a common profession for free and enslaved Black women. Marchands like Lucette Barberousse sold coffee, fruits and vegetables, spruce, ginger, and pineapple beers, sweet treats like pralines and cala, and more. In travelogues and newspapers, tourists and residents in New Orleans, Charleston, and other port cities wrote often about marchands. The calls or cries these vendors made to advertise their wares to customers were a memorable feature of life in these cosmopolitan places. When a judge ordered Barberousse and her family to be transferred to Marie Olive Saint Laurent in 1835, the new household that resulted included free and enslaved women of color who had been born along the path of refugees' flight from the Haitian Revolution. Lucette and her mother had been born in Port-au-Prince, Saint-Domingue. Saint Laurent, their enslaver, had been born in Santiago de Cuba, and Lucette's 3 children were all born in New Orleans. Just this one household demonstrated the linguistic, ethnic, and racial diversity of early New Orleans, not to mention the fact that skin color certainly did not equate to freedom or enslavement during this era. Lucette Barberousse's path would soon intersect with that of another migration stream to New Orleans. In early 1838, Saint Laurent sold Lucette, her mother, and Lucette's new infant daughter to a neighbor in the French Quarter named Michel Grabiel. Grabiel was a 19-year-old Italian immigrant, and he bought the women for $650. Saint Laurent specified that Grabiel should manumit the 3 as soon as possible, releasing them from slavery. And at this time, Lucette Barberousse's 3 older daughters, Annette, Louisa, and Etienne, remained enslaved to Saint Laurent. Grabiel kept his promise and soon petitioned to free Lucette, her mother, and baby Lucette. This is the notarial document that resulted in the manumission of Lucette. So to the notary, Grabiel cited 2 motivations for the request. First, he identified himself as the father of baby Lucette. And second, during a long and serious illness, the notary recorded, Grabiel was cared for night and day by Lucette Barberousse and her mother, whose care and kindness cannot be overstated. The 3 women were freed in November 1838 when Lucette was about 42, her mother was 75, and baby Lucette was likely approaching 1 year old. This was Lucette Barberousse's first experience of freedom on American soil, but not all of her family was free. She would see to it that this would not remain the case for long. Just 3 months later, in early 1839, Lucette returned to her former enslaver to purchase her 3 older daughters. For $700, Lucette bought Annette, Louisa, and Etienne, who are now 16, 12, and 10. For a time, at least in the eyes of authorities, Lucette became her daughter's enslaver. How did Barberousse assemble $700 to buy her 3 daughters shortly after her own manumission from slavery? Perhaps she had set aside wages during her years working as an enslaved marchand, or perhaps Grabiel had assisted her with the purchase. Regardless, the year after reassembling her family under her roof, Lucette Barberousse appears in the 1840 federal census as the head of a New Orleans household of 9 women of color. One person in the household, certainly Lucette, was employed, engaged in commerce, so her labors as a marchand supported the family. Still, not all of her family was free, so she took a final step. 2 years after purchasing her daughters, Barberousse manumitted them from slavery. In the presence of a city official, Barberousse made her mark on a notarial act, and you can see her X on the top right of the screen. With this mark, she freed Annette, Louisa, and Etienne, as well as a new 1-year-old granddaughter, Marie-Agnès. Finally, this family of 4 generations of women, from baby Marie-Agnès to her great-grandmother Jadzie, was free. In the years leading up to this moment, Barberousse had labored continuously as a marchand. When she was enslaved in the early 1830s, this work had helped determine Barberousse's value as a woman in bondage. But in ensuing years, as Barberousse passed into the hands of Marie Olive Saint-Laurent, Michel Grabiel, and then into her own home as a free woman, her labors and the value of each article sold, each payment collected and slipped into a pocket, must have taken on new meaning. Working as a marchand enabled Barberousse to attain freedom and sustain a home and independence for herself and her family. When we read different kinds of historical sources side by side, autobiographies of formerly enslaved people, and the records of notaries, judges, census takers, together with visual materials like architectural plans, maps, and drawings, we can begin to assemble partial paths of food entrepreneurs like Catherine, Charlotte, Lucette Barberousse, and others. Together, these kinds of records supply brief biographies to New Orleans' culinary reputation, clarifying the wide-ranging roles and skills of the people who fed the city. Between the lines, these fragmented records spoke too to the persistence and resourcefulness of New Orleanians who built homes and grew families in the face of enormous challenges. Before Barberousse turned 40, she had lived in French and Spanish colonies in the Caribbean and the United States and had labored in the service of at least 3 enslavers. Once manumitted, even though she was illiterate, she pressed through a multi-step bureaucratic process in a bilingual legal system to purchase and free her daughters and granddaughter, then support their free household. Barberousse and her family were not wealthy Creoles of color with deep roots and resources in Louisiana. They were the working poor, a family of women whose generations straddled regimes, languages, and geographies. Lucette Barberousse's labors as a marchand remained a constant thread in their story, though, as they moved from slavery to freedom to independence together. 100 years later, another New Orleans entrepreneur used her work with food to make her restaurant an explicitly political space. Elements of her story may be familiar to you. And with her story, we move to our mid-20th century New Orleans table. Entrepreneur Leah Chase fed civil rights activists, celebrity athletes, musicians, politicians, local business leaders, clergy, and neighborhood regulars too. Chase was born in 1923 in Madisonville, and she moved to New Orleans to attend high school. Her initial experiences in the New Orleans restaurant industry came in a setting in which she was paid to serve, but not welcomed to eat alongside her customers. Having worked as a waitress at the French Quarter Cafe, the Coffee Pot, in the 1940s, Chase remembered, quote, "There were no restaurants for Black people to go to." By the 1950s, even if there were Black-owned restaurants, tables weren't being set in Black restaurants. When you went in, they would just hand you a fork and a knife or whatever, she described. In 1957, Leah and her husband Edgar Dookie Chase Jr. took over his parents' restaurant, Dookie Chase. The business was located on a corner in the Treme neighborhood of New Orleans. Less than 20 years earlier, in 1939, the Federal Homeowners Loan Corporation had stamped that intersection and surrounding blocks red on its maps, calling it a, quote, hazardous zone occupied by low-class common laborers and mechanics, 90% of whom were Black. The Chases, of course, held a very different perspective on this neighborhood that was home to them and their families and friends. They set out to give New Orleanians of color a cultural and culinary institution that they had long lacked. Leah Chase understood that Black cooks and servers had long helped to produce the aesthetic and gustatory experiences of the Creole meal. Now Chase sought to provide a place where Black diners could finally enjoy that experience themselves. With Dookie Chase, Leah Chase created the first white tablecloth restaurant for Black New Orleanians. I wanted mirrors on one wall and another wall with red velour, she described. Despite protests from her mother-in-law, Chase insisted on a particular object for the renovated dining room. I remembered a beautiful chair I had seen at a restaurant in the French Quarter called the Vieux Carré. Each chair was $25, she said, but I won the battle. In a city where Black residents were fighting to sit in the same streetcar, bus, and lunch counter seats as whites, Chase insisted on the same elegantly designed chair for her restaurant dining room that white diners enjoyed in the French Quarter. Such attention to detail struck a young Raphael Casimir Jr., who first came to Dookie Chase while participating in the 1960 state convention of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP. I was very impressed because we had little Black restaurants that were okay, they were clean, he said, but they may have had maybe 4 to 6 tables, did not have tablecloths. But this was kind of a fancy restaurant, he said in an oral history, similar to what I had seen on television. Casimir returned many times in ensuing years to enjoy the mouth-watering authentic Creole dishes that earned Chef Chase fame. These included veal pane, gumbo, jambalaya, shrimp clemenceau, fried oysters, stuffed crabs, praline pudding, and more. On Holy Thursday, Chase prepared gumbo zerbe made with 9 greens: watercress, beet tops, mustard greens, collard greens, carrot tops, lettuce, spinach, cabbage, and Swiss chard, enriched and flavored with smoked sausage, smoked ham, hot chorizo, boneless brisket, and brisket stew meat. Customers lined up outside the restaurant for this indulgence, enjoyed alongside fried chicken as they anticipated Good Friday's abstinence from meat. Under Leah Chase's decades-long leadership, the restaurant became much more than a destination for a good meal in a beautiful setting. Leah Chase and others later recalled Dookie Chase as an epicenter of the local and regional civil rights movement. Famously, Chase said in an interview, "I feel like in this restaurant we changed the course of the world over bowls of gumbo. That's how we always did the planning, over gumbo." Newspaper articles throughout the 1950s noted lunches at Dookie Chase sponsored by local Black men's and women's social and political clubs. In 1957, a leader of the Urban League of Greater New Orleans reassured the assembled crowd that public school integration would soon come. Chase cooked for Jackie Robinson, Harry Belafonte, and in 1959, Nereus Namaso Mbile, a Cameroonian journalist and politician. Earlier in the day, Mbile had received a key to the city and a certificate of honorary citizenship at City Hall, yet he could not have celebrated afterward with a meal at nearby Antoine's or Galatoire's. Instead, he traveled across the French Quarter to Tremé to eat at Dookie Chase. By the early 1960s, Raphael Casimir Jr. remembered the restaurant serving as an unofficial base of civil rights planners. He explained it was sort of a cooling off place after leaving meetings at the headquarters of the New Orleans NAACP, where members planned boycotts of Canal Street businesses and other action. In spring 1961, when the Congress of Racial Equality hosted a banquet meal to honor freedom riders, they held the event at Dookie Chase. When the restaurant celebrated core activists, some arenas of urban life were desegregating with relatively little conflict. New Orleans libraries, buses, and streetcars had desegregated in 1955 and 1958. Integration at the table, however, came slower. To talk about hiring some Black clerks in stores was one thing, remembered New Orleans activist and lawyer Lolis Ely. But to start talking about social change, social life, going to the same restaurants was considered to be really radical. Louis Laudier, a Black journalist who had attended Dillard University and was the first Black member of the White House Correspondents Association and National Press Club, agreed. Having traveled the world, he concluded in 1960, the glamour of New Orleans may be there for the white visitor. He can visit the city's renowned restaurants, but New Orleans is still strictly Jim Crow. Civil rights workers would soon use the city's restaurants to achieve a significant triumph, however. In 1963, New Orleans activists who had led multiple sit-ins at lunch counters on Canal Street, enduring verbal and physical abuse, won a landmark U.S. Supreme Court case whose decision outlawed segregation in restaurants. In his opinion, Chief Justice Earl Warren affirmed that running a business, quote, on the basis of apartheid was foreign to our Constitution. To those who might try to argue that a restaurant was a private rather than public space, the court declared, access by the public to a restaurant is the very reason for its existence. This victory was generations in the making and the result of careful training, study, and bravery. Civil rights activists had demanded a place at the New Orleans table and won on behalf of Americans everywhere. In ensuing decades, Black chefs in New Orleans continued to feed and nourish the customers who walked through their doors. Leah Chase never moved her business from its original location for reasons more philosophical than practical. It would have been easy to relocate to what some would call a better place, she acknowledged early in the first decade of the 2000s. We are surrounded by the projects. But Chase explained that her restaurant sent a message to the neighbors next door, as well as diners who came from far away. Everyone deserved a beautiful place to eat. Her restaurant belonged to and within a community. It wasn't very large, but it was comfortable and it was cozy, remembered Raphael Casimir Jr., who became a professor and an activist years after first setting foot in the restaurant as a young person. It was so alive, he said. You'd see the pillars of the Black community there. Carmen Morial, a lifelong New Orleanian and another patron, agreed. Within a segregated city and even a city in segregation's wake, Dooky Chase was a good haven for all of us who wanted to go somewhere nice, Morial recalled. It was a good place to go where you were safe from criticism. With bowls of gumbo, white tablecloths, and an open door, Leah Chase upheld a Black Creole culinary heritage that had been built by the likes of Catherine, Charlotte, Lucette Barberousse, and unnamed thousands before her, and would be made stronger still by those who came after her, including chefs Tunde Way, Nina Compton, Serene Mbe, and others. Among other ingredients, all set their tables with rice, a grain whose journey had begun thousands of miles and hundreds of years away. I go to sleep thinking about food, Leah Chase wrote in 1990 at the age of 67. I have a stack of cookbooks by my bed. You read things or hear ideas, and then your mind starts turning. For nearly 3 decades more, Chase continued to read, her mind continued to turn, and she and others continued to cook. So thank you very much, and I would be happy to hear your questions and look forward to our conversation.
Fantastic, Theresa. That was, yeah, I can imagine that took a lot of research.
Yeah, I spent, I think about 11 years.
11 years.
Project, yeah. So,
So,
but it
so,
was,
so then I don't want to leave that. I want to, if you do have questions, please put them in the chat. I will ask them. But I do want to talk about your research process. One, why did it take 11 years? And also at the same time, like, where did you ever have some jackpot moments that you were like, oh man, at this location I hit on this? Because this research is fast as I have a master's. You learn to love research.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. It was my doctoral dissertation, and then I just took a while revising it and wanted to improve some things and look at some different archives. And New Orleans just has a wealth of wonderful places to research, archives and research institutions. It's a really unique city for the breadth of its history and just the extent to which it has been recorded, especially even the very early history. The notarial archives are an incredible place to go to look at early records from the 1700s, if not earlier. In terms of a kind of aha moment or a jackpot moment, I will point to one particular kind of source that ended up being very important for me, and that's accessible to anybody. Any of your listeners could find it online, but from 1840 to the Civil War, New Orleans required free people of color who were living in the city to register with the mayor's office to prove that they were capable of living in the city. So there were 4 volumes of this registry that exist in state collections. And in it, people had to indicate their names, where they were born, when they came to New Orleans. And a professor at the University of Arkansas, I believe, took it upon himself as a personal project to transcribe all of these registers into a huge open spreadsheet. So what that allowed me to do was to text search throughout the spreadsheet, and I could see over that period of time certain names being repeated. And one of the names being repeated was that of Lucette Barberousse. And anytime there's a repeated name, there are some other bits of data that she submitted to the mayor's office each time. And so, especially when you're researching enslaved people or free people of color during this early era, any bit of data is kind of a handhold or a foothold that you can use to look for something else. And so that directed me to look at census records, at notarial records. And so, again, kind of piecing things together and looking at things side by side really helped me to trace her path, which was so incredible. And finding that one particular source where she made her mark to manumit her daughters was amazing. I mean, you understand you are standing over a piece of paper that this woman was standing over, 200 years ago. It's a pretty awesome thing to find. But there's many examples and many kinds of sources like that.
Wonderful. Judy asked, great presentation. Did you come across Chef Lena Richard, who's her great aunt? She was born from 1882 to 1959.
I did, and that's wonderful, amazing that you are related to her. She has an incredible history as well, and I write about her also in the 5th chapter of my book, where I write about Leah Chase. But Chef Lena Richard was an incredible chef and entrepreneur and a television personality in the very, very early days of television. She cooked all over the country and had frozen food business and a catering business, and her history is incredible. And so absolutely, I encourage listeners to read about her story if you aren't familiar with it. But absolutely, her story is very inspiring too.
JGC asked, Creole Feast seemed to be groundbreaking. Can you comment on that book and the collection of recipes?
Sure. So, yes, it was groundbreaking. So this is a book that was published in 1978, and it was co-authored by a chef and a civil rights activist in New Orleans. And the idea behind this book was to open the door to the restaurant kitchen, the doors of restaurant kitchens in New Orleans, which were so often closed to diners. So people would come to these fine dining Creole restaurants and eat these incredible meals. And more often than not, the incredibly skilled work that was happening in the kitchens, there were Black chefs and pastry cooks and line cooks who were preparing these meals, but really were not able to be known, not allowed to be known by the public and by diners, and to really be lauded for the food they created. And so this book, Creole Feast, introduced these people to New Orleans and the world. And it's really a collection of transcribed interviews, and the chefs in this book share some of their recipes, and it was really a kind of watershed moment for these people and their work to be known and acknowledged. And it's still, I have a copy of the book. It's still a book that is used and appreciated today.
John asked, how did your personal time in New Orleans enhance your understanding and research?
That's a good question. Well, first, I will say my very first trip there, I came in August, and that was an initial introduction to the the impressive humidity of New Orleans at that time. But I loved my time in the city. I made repeated trips there of several weeks at a time to research and to eat and enjoy the city. And I'll say that I came to New Orleans as an outsider, and I'm still an outsider. So I had never really did not have fixed impressions or expectations of the city beyond what any newcomer would. But just it's a again, it's a place that has had its culinary heritage at the center of its identity for literally hundreds of years, and that history is again present in the archives, but it's present too in the city as you walk around it and enjoy just the amazing wealth of neighborhoods and places to appreciate and enjoy food, and you see that enjoyment and excitement about it still everywhere today, and among the tourists who come too.
And that and to kind of wind us up here, your presentation also made me think about some other trends, and also some people who did do some work after, that inspired by obviously Leah Chase, and the work was definitely her son now who's involved, the daughters that are now involved. One I thought of was Jack Lenardi, who owns Giacomo's, and he brought Austin Leslie in to do his after when his restaurant closed. But that was those are all things that were really interesting. And then this new kind of wave of black owned restaurants, including Morrow's Steakhouse in the CBD, and I think he's got another one, a Barrow Steakhouse, I think it is, or there's a couple of them, and how they're basically stepping into running these restaurants. And I find these all fascinating, and just part of the story of the New Orleans food scene. And it's very interesting to see all of those different things that's happened over the years and what's growing.
Right. No, I agree. During my last trip in the city, I was lucky to be able to eat at Dakar Nola and had it's a wonderful menu. And I sat at the communal table, and I was there traveling on my own, and so got to sit with visitors who were from different parts of the country, but also international. And one of the courses on the tasting menu is a casserole of rice, a pot of rice. And so just to the point of just the deep history of ingredients and people that continues, and in that particular restaurant uses the food and the setting as a time to talk about history and the present, and to show how all of those things are braided together. I mean, it's a great experience that just the dining scene there continues to evolve in very interesting and wonderful ways, as it always has.
Well, Theresa, I want to thank you so much. This was a fantastic presentation. You did amazing work. I wish you the best on your on the book tour, and also at the same time, we will get the recording out with the discount, so you guys can get it at a 30% discount from University of Chicago Press. With that, I want to thank everybody for being here tonight. Thank you for being here tonight, and we'll see everybody. If you're on up for the Founding New Orleans class, we'll see you tomorrow. If not, we'll see you in October for our next member lecture theory series. Thank you, Theresa, so much.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for attending. Thanks.
Bye.
All right. Bye-bye.